his killing began in 1974. So, we talked about in the last video how he may or may not have been responsible for the disappearance of Anne Marie Burr. Ted Bundy would actually confess to killing someone in 1969 while he was in Philadelphia visiting family. He's kind of alluded to the fact that he killed someone in Seattle in 1972, but would never give any specifics or anything like that. And he vaguely talked about killing a hitchhiker in 1973. So while he very well may have been killing before 1974, this is when his killings, or like documented killings, began. So this is when we know for sure he was actively killing women. Around this time, many women in the Seattle area and nearby Oregon went missing. Stories circulated that some of these victims were last seen in the company of a handsome young man with dark hair known as Ted. He often lured his victims into his car by pretending that he was injured and asking for help. So let's get into some of his victims. In January of 1974, Ted Bundy broke into an apartment. Inside was 18-year-old Joanie Lentz. Again, she is going by a different name, but most sources refer to her as Joanie Lentz. Joanie was a shy girl. She had friends, but she was definitely more of an introvert. Joanie rented a room in a house, and her apartment in this house was in the basement. So that night, Ted enters her bedroom, and the next day, her roommates don't see her around in the morning like they normally do, and even by that afternoon, she hasn't come out of her bedroom, so they decide to go down and check on her. They found her laying in her bed, covered in dry blood. Joanie had been beaten with a metal rod before being sexually assaulted with the rod. While Joanie was in bad condition, she was alive. She was rushed to a local hospital where she was treated. Although there was damage done that she would never recover from. Joanie sustained brain damage during her attack and has no memory of the night. Police investigated the attack on Joanie after speaking with all of her friends and family members, though. They came to the conclusion that this had been a random attack because Joanie had no enemies, and there were really no motives to want to hurt Joanie. Later that same month, Ted Bundy attacked 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy. Linda was a beautiful woman. She was tall and thin with gorgeous blue eyes. She worked as a ski forecaster for the Northwest Ski Reports and was a senior at Washington State University. She also lived in a home that was shared with other students. Linda and all of her roommates had actually heard about the attack on Joanie Lentz, so they were taking extra precautions until the attacker was arrested. On January 31st, 1973, Linda woke up. shrugs it off and figures Linda just went to work and forgot to turn it off. But soon, Linda's boss would call the house looking for her because she hadn't shown up to work. Linda's bike was still at the house, so her roommates start looking around and they realize that the side door was unlocked. And this was very disturbing to all of them because they were being so careful in the light of the attack that had happened earlier. Linda had never been late for work, let alone just not shown up at all, and the door being unlocked really scared them. That evening, Linda's parents had been planning to come over because Linda was going to cook dinner for them, but when they showed up, Linda wasn't home. She was nowhere to be found. So her parents ended up calling police to come over to the house so they could file a missing persons report. Now, like I said, Linda wasn't known for making her bed in the morning. She was usually in a hurry. She would get up and leave the house early and then come home and make her bed when she had a little more time. So the fact that her bed is made and not just like, you know how you can like pull your comforter over the top of your bed and consider that made? No, it was like almost professionally made. So this was suspicious. A police officer pulled back the comforter and found Lisa's pillowcase and sheets were covered in blood. Her nightgown was also covered in blood, and this was found in her closet. As police processed the scene, they uncovered a single hair that didn't belong to Linda, and it was taken into evidence. They began searching for Linda right away, but they really had no leads to go on. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anything, and police didn't even know where to start searching. They searched the area surrounding the girl's house, but they found no additional evidence to steer their investigation in any one direction. A year would go by before Linda's decapitated remains would be discovered at Taylor's mountain site. Linda's remains were obviously in like a very late state of decomposition, but her bones would tell the story of a brutal attack. Ted Bundy would later confess that he had broken into her bedroom, beat Linda, changed her clothes, and then carried her right out of her house. On March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, who was 19 years old, was abducted while walking to a concert at Evergreen State College. She just never arrived. See, Donna played the flute. She was smart, and like all of Ted Bundy's previous victims, had long dark hair parted down the middle. But Donna was a little bit of like a wild card. She smoked a lot of pot, and she often went on these solo adventures, sometimes taking off without telling anyone she was leaving and just hitchhiking around. So because of this, she wasn't reported missing right away because everyone thought eventually she would just show back up. According to Ted Bundy, he left her body at the Taylor Mountain site where Linda's body was found, but police have never recovered her remains. On April 17th, Elaine Rancourt, who was just 18 years old, disappeared. Susan was herself and put herself through college. After college, she was planning on attending medical school. On April 17th, Susan went to an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College. She walked to the advisor meeting alone in the dark. The meeting ended at 9, and she was planning on meeting up with her friends afterwards to go to the movies, but Susan never showed up. Her skull and mandible were recovered at the Taylor Mountain site in 1975, and this Taylor Mountain site became known as Bundy's graveyard. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks, a 22-year-old Oregon State University student, vanished. She left her dorm room to meet up with friends for coffee, and she never arrived. Her skull and mandible were also recovered at the Taylor Mountain site in 1975. By this point, there were too many missing women, and police began to realize they had a serial predator on their hands. There wasn't any physical evidence. These women just all went missing. And police really tried and failed to connect these women in any way. The only thing they had in common were their looks. Long dark hair, parted in the middle, and they were all very thin, petite college students. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball left the Flame Tavern in Burien and was never seen again. Brenda left around 2 a.m. and was seen asking another patron at the bar for a ride, but I guess this guy was going in the other direction. I don't know, for some reason she didn't get into his car. She was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man who had his arm in a sling, like it was broken. The next year, her skull and mandible would be found in Bundy's graveyard. 10 days later, on June 11th, 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins was abducted from an alley behind her sorority house. Georgianne was a straight-A student. She had a boyfriend, and she was just a really beautiful girl. On June 10th, Georgianne went out with one of her sorority sisters to a party, and she had some drinks, but then she left to go to her boyfriend's house. After leaving his home, she was hurrying to her house, which was like just 5 or 6 houses away. There was like this back alley because she had a test she had to study for. So she leaves his house, telling him she needs to go home and study. As she was walking back to her house, one of her friends saw her walking past and opened the window and kind of talked to her through the window for a few minutes. She was never seen again. As police investigated, they found out that Georgia Ann's dorm mother had actually awoken to a scream, but thought it was just kids goofing off. Ted confessed to murdering Georgianne, and her skeletal remains were recovered. witnesses described a good-looking man with his left arm in a sling who was introducing himself as Ted. He was asking for help unloading a sailboat from his car. Both of the women's remains would be found at the Issaquah site. Now, these last two abductions and murders happened in broad daylight from crowded areas, so we can see Ted is getting more and more bold in his crimes. Because there were so many witnesses, police now have a description of their killer, and they would release a sketch. More than one tip would actually come in about Ted Bundy, but police would look at him, this clean-cut law student who volunteered and was involved in politics, and he didn't fit the profile, so they didn't suspect him. He had no criminal record, so, and because they were swamped with other tips, they weren't super interested in Ted Bundy. In August of 1974, Ted Bundy moved to Utah to study law at the University of Utah Law School. Some people say the only reason he got into law school was because of his political connections and not because of his grades. But as soon as Ted Bundy showed up in Utah, women started disappearing. On October 2nd, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox was abducted, assaulted, and strangled in Holiday, Utah. According to Bundy, he buried her body near Capitol Reef National Park, which is about 200 miles away from Salt Lake City, but her remains have never been found. On October 18th, 17-year-old Melissa Ann Smith vanished from Midvale, Utah. Melissa's father was a police chief for the city of Midvale when she vanished. Melissa was last seen leaving a pizza parlor where she had met up with friends. She left on foot, but she never made it home. Her body was discovered 9 days later in a nearby mountainous area. On October 31st, 17-year-old Laura Ann Amy disappeared from Lehi, Utah. She was bludgeoned to death and sexually assaulted, and her body was found in American Fork Canyon by a hiker. On November 8th, 18-year-old Carol Durant left her house and headed to a local mall in Murray, Utah. She ran into some people she knew at the mall. She chatted with them for a bit, and then she headed to a bookstore where a handsome man approached her. He asked her where she had parked her car, and then said that he had witnessed someone trying to break into her car. So she leaves, heads out of the mall with this guy. I think she thought he was maybe a security guard or an undercover police officer. She didn't really question who he was until they walked out into the rainy night, and then she just gets this feeling like something is wrong. And this guy who had seemed so harmless inside the mall is suddenly like making the hair on the back of her neck stand up. So she asks him for ID, and he just starts laughing. And I guess this made her feel very childish. So they get to her car, and it's totally fine. Nothing's missing. No one has broken into it. And he's like, look, you're gonna have to come down to the police station with me anyway to fill out a report. So she police station, she begins trying to get out. Ted Bundy stopped the car and reached over and tried to handcuff her, but he somehow handcuffs, there's two of them, put both of them around just one of her wrists. She was like fighting back and making it very difficult for him to get the handcuffs on her. Then he pulled out a gun and she's able to scramble out of the car, and she falls down onto the ground, and he quickly gets out of the car and he's holding a crowbar. Carol was able to run away. She gets up and takes off running. She runs into the road, and another car with like an older couple driving it stops, and she gets in and they take her to the police station. Police now have a description of the man and his car and a sample of his blood, which Carol had on her body from the struggle. Like, she fought until she got away, and when she did, she had physical evidence on her body. But just because Carol got away didn't mean Ted Bundy was going to stop. On the same day, he would come across Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old who was leaving a school play in Bountiful, Utah. Neighbors who lived near the school reported hearing two screams shortly after 10:30. One even went outside to see if she could see anything, but she couldn't. According to Ted, he left her body near Fairview, Utah. The only remains found of hers was one piece of a patella, so like part of her kneecap. But this wasn't even found and ID'd as hers until 2015. At this point, several women had gone missing in Washington, and Meg had called the police to report that she believed Ted Bundy might be responsible for these, but Washington police had dismissed her. But she knows Ted has moved to Utah, and suddenly all of these women start going missing in Utah, and this is being reported like nationwide on the news. So Meg calls police again. This time she is interviewed by police, and they even brought in some witnesses and showed them some pictures of Ted from the lineup. So all the witnesses from the lake were brought in and showed a photo lineup, but no one picked out Ted, and Ted wasn't thought to be suspicious. So Meg is getting frustrated that Washington police are not taking her seriously. So she calls Salt Lake Police Department and tells them what she knows. So police have Ted's name, but there's nothing suspicious about this guy at all. So they're just kind of keeping an eye on him. In January of 1975, Ted takes a quick trip to Seattle to see Meg, his kind of girlfriend who keeps reporting him to the police. And she is happy to see him and lets him come in, and he stays at her apartment. I don't know why. If she thought he was dangerous, why she continued to let him come into her home where she lived with her daughter, but we will see this over and over again with Meg. There was a lot of heat on Ted in Utah, not like Ted in particular, but there were a lot of women going missing, and people were very suspicious of anyone they didn't know. So Ted decided to start attacking women wasn't in her room, and police were called pretty quickly after this. They conducted a search of the hotel and the surrounding areas, but they could find no trace of Karen. Her body was discovered 36 days later on Owl Creek Road, near the hotel. Her body had been buried in snow for much of the time that people had been looking for her, and she had been disfigured by animals. She suffered blows to the back of the head. Her hands had been bound, and she had likely been thrown from a car. On March 15th, 26-year-old Julie Cunningham disappeared. She was walking to a bar in Vail, Colorado to meet up with friends, but she never made it. Ted said he approached her, his arm in a sling, and asked if she would help him carry his skis to a car, and then he attacked her and strangled her to death. According to Bundy, he buried her near Rifle, Colorado, but her remains have never been found. On April 6th, Denise Lynn Oliverson, age 25, was cycling near her parents' house in Grand Junction, Colorado, when she was abducted. Now, she was married, and she had gotten into an argument with her husband and had left their home on her bike to go to her parents' house. Her parents had no idea she was coming, so when she didn't show up, no one knew. And when she didn't come home that night, her husband figured she was just cooling off at her parents' house, and she would return. But the next morning, he called her parents' house, and this was when he realized she had never made it there. Ted Bundy would confess to killing her and throwing her body into the Colorado River west of Grand Junction, but her remains have never been found. On May 6th, Lynn Dawn Culver, who was just 12 years old, was abducted from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho. Ted Bundy confessed to killing her and throwing her body into a river, which police believe was the Snake River, but her body has never been found. On June 28th, Susan Curtis, who was 15 years old, disappeared during a youth conference at Brigham Young University. Bundy told authorities he buried her body near Price, Utah, but she has never been found. Susan's murder would be the last of Ted Bundy's confessions, which were recorded a short time before he entered the execution chamber. Soon after Ted had moved to Utah, he had actually been approached by two members of the Mormon Church. They began chatting with him, and he expressed an interest in joining their congregation. The Lake Ledge reported that a missionary named Larry Anderson was the man who taught and baptized Ted Bundy in August of 1975, so right in the middle of his killing spree. He joins the Mormon Church. He was semi-active within the Mormon Church. He attended a few events and made some friends with his fellow Mormons. On August 16th, 1975, Ted Bundy was arrested in Utah. A highway patrol had pulled him over after they noticed Ted's car driving around a neighborhood in the early morning hours with no headlights. So Ted passes by a car, realizes it's a police car, and takes off out of the neighborhood super fast, which was very suspicious to the police officer inside. So he followed him and pulled him over. Ted's car was searched, and the search would uncover a cache of burglary tools, including a crowbar, a face mask, rope, and handcuffs. The front seat of Ted's car had also been removed. He was arrested for possession of these tools, and soon police would begin to link him to more sinister crimes. So after Ted was arrested, a search warrant was issued to search his home. He was arrested on suspicion of burglary. So they get a search warrant to go search his home, thinking they'll find a lot of stolen stuff and be able to arrest him for burglary. Inside, officers found a Colorado ski resort guide from the 1974-75 ski season, with a check mark next to the Wildwood Inn where Karen Campbell had been killed, as well as an advertisement for the Viewmont High School play where Karen had been taken before being killed, like she had been taken from, not taken to. But police had nothing at this point to hold him on these suspicion of burglary charges. They had arrested him on, so they had to let him go. What police didn't know, as they were releasing Ted Bundy, was the hidden inside his home, the home they had just searched, were Polaroid pictures, this Polaroid collection of his victims. Even though police couldn't hold them, they knew Ted Bundy was up to no good, and they began round-the-clock surveillance. After this, 2 detectives flew out to Seattle to interview Meg because, remember, she had called and given them a heads up on Ted earlier. This is really the first time we see police taking an interest in what Meg has to say. She told them of her suspicions of Ted, how she kept finding the most random things around the house that didn't make sense, like crutches, an arm sling, plaster of Paris, a meat cleaver, surgical gloves, and a sack of women's clothing that didn't belong to her. She also told police how he flipped out one time when she casually mentioned that she wanted to cut her hair short. Meg, of course, had dark brown, long hair parted down the middle. One of the more alarming things that she would tell police was how sometimes she would wake up at night and Ted Bundy would be down under the covers of their bed with a flashlight, just looking at her body. So, there's a lot of red flags there. 1 month after his arrest, Ted Bundy sold his Volkswagen to a teenager in Salt Lake. Police tracked down this car and impounded it, and it was turned over to an FBI forensic team who searched the car piece by piece. They took the car apart piece by piece. They discovered physical evidence that would link him to Karen Campbell. They also found several strands of hair that were later ID'd as belonging Witnesses were also brought in from Viewmont High School who could positively ID Ted as being the guy who was wandering around the school. Bundy was arrested for aggravated kidnapping and the assault of Carol Durant. Ted's parents bailed him out. It was like a $15,000 bail. They bailed him out, and after he got out, he moved back to Seattle, where he would live with Meg. Police continued around-the-clock surveillance on Ted, and Meg would later talk about how if they ever left the house to go anywhere, all of these unmarked police cars would follow them. There was this massive convention that was called Aspen Summit, with detectives and law enforcement as well as FBI agents from 5 different states, where they all got together and compared notes on their missing and murdered women. As this meeting wrapped up, everyone was in agreement that Ted Bundy was their serial killer, but they needed evidence to prove this. On February 23rd, 1976, Ted Bundy's trial began for the kidnapping of Durant. He waived his right to a jury, and on March 1st, he was found guilty of kidnapping and assault, and he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. The detectives working Bundy's case were hard at work trying to link him to all of the missing women, using his credit card statements to kind of track his movements. These credit card statements would later place him in the vicinity of almost all of the missing and murdered women. While in prison, Bundy was charged with the murder of Campbell, which he committed in Colorado, and he was transferred to a prison in Aspen, Colorado, so he could stand trial for that crime. In June of 1977, Ted was transferred to a courthouse for a hearing. He was serving as his own attorney at the time. Remember, he had gone to law school, although he had not graduated. So during a recess, he asks if he can go to the library to research his case. There, he hid behind a bookcase, climbed out of a window, and jumped from a second-story floor of the courthouse. He broke his arm in this fall, but it didn't stop him from making it past the courthouse roadblocks and into the woods, where he stayed for 6 days. He stole a car, broke into a camping trailer to get supplies, and was kind of living on the run. But ultimately, 2 police officers spotted him and apprehended him, and he was taken back to prison. Later that same year, around Christmas time, Ted Bundy escaped again. He climbed out of a hole he had made in the ceiling of his cell. He had actually lost 30 pounds in order to fit up into this little hole. Authorities didn't discover he was missing for 15 hours, so he had a pretty good head start. He had somehow gotten a map of the jail, so he had crawled out of this hole Lisa Levy. The other two students survived. Soon after the news began reporting about this attack on Chi Omega, word came in that a child had disappeared 90 miles to the east. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, a 7th grader from Lake City, Florida, had gone missing in the middle of a school day on February 9th, 1976. Kimberly had actually been having a great day before she went missing. She had just found out she was the runner-up to the Queen of the Valentine's Day dance at her junior high. She, went to one of her classes and realized she had left her purse in her homeroom class, which was in a different building. So her teacher said she could run back and get it, so she leaves. And this is when she disappears. Now, several people would see Kimberly leaving with an angry-looking man, but people didn't think anything of it at the time. It looked like a dad had come to retrieve his child from school. And even though Kimberly was crying, this didn't raise red flags. People thought that either she'd gotten in trouble or she was sick. Either way, her dad had come to take her home. That afternoon, the school called Kimberly's home to notify her parents that she had not attended her afternoon classes. And she was not the kind of girl who ever skipped class, so her parents knew something was wrong right away. Lake City police searched for Kimberly, but nothing was found. Her body was found in April of 1978, 8 weeks after she went missing. She had been assaulted and murdered and then placed in a little shed in a wooded area behind the Joanie River State Park. And Kimberly would be the final victim of Ted Bundy's. So I'm going to stop right here. We have talked about all of Ted's victims. In our next and last video on this case, we will talk about the demise of Ted Bundy, his arrest, his trial, and his execution. So please join me for that. It will be released in a few days. If you are on Patreon, you already have access to this entire mini-series, so you can head over there. And if you would like to join Patreon, please do. It is a great way to support this channel. I will leave the link down in the description. I'll see you guys next time.